And many of you have heard the story that the beginnings of which were read. How many of you heard that in Sunday school sometime? Yeah. This is the story that run up to the birth and the life of Moses, the great lawgiver of Israel. Now, if you haven't heard the story, you're about to, okay? You can find it in the book of Exodus. And I just need to give you a heads up right here that I'm preaching a sermon that I myself would like to hear and don't hear much of in a world that's currently on fire, in case you didn't notice. Because it's a story about a man who comes from a really dysfunctional family and after getting kicked in the head by his own people, winds up in prison in another nation, and by a miracle of God's activity and his faithfulness, gets exalted to as high a place as he was in a low one, and becomes the man who saves the country from famine, makes the Pharaoh or the king rich, the nation is Egypt, and finds a place to bring the family that hated him in the first place down to safety. And they all come, and they live happily ever after. We wish. Have you noticed we haven't got to happily ever after yet, if we ever get out of here? Yeah. A new king came to power in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. Now, I spent some time in Cambodia a while ago and met all kinds of people who had never heard of Pol Pot. Pol Pot was a leader in Cambodia who in the 70s, 60s, and 70s saw to the deaths of 1.4 million of his own countrymen, and those countrymen who survived did not know who he was. Which means that unless you have a constant stream of news the way we have now, didn't exist there, probably still doesn't, you don't know what's going on. And in particular here, after all that Joseph had done for that nation, this king is probably not in the line of kings Joseph served. Regime change. Anybody heard anything about regime change lately? Oh, yeah. You listen to that too, do you? Yeah. Regime overthrow. I don't know you. What have you done for me lately? And he spoke to his people in alarm and basically said to them, there's too many of these people. They're going to take over. Anybody seen anything about that in the internet lately? They move in, they have babies, they take over your country. Check it out under Muslim immigration. Just Google it. See what you get. Tons of stuff. It's as old and as new as our fear of one another. If we leave them the way they are, they'll either join our enemies or they'll abandon us and the enemies can take over anyway. And notice, nobody said here, let's go talk to them and make friends. We don't change. Not at this front. So they organized them into work gangs, put them out to work, and there's a whole paragraph here which I will condense into this. Work them hard, work them harder, make them slaves, fear them more. My wife comes from the Simcoe area of Ontario. It's a beautiful North Shore, Lake Erie area. There's a Carolinian forest there, which has a very unique ecosystem and has not been developed in any way, which means that it has to be preserved. And not a lot of people have ever gone into this place to do much. There's no cottages, there's no roads, and it's preserved as such. But if you went back about 150 years, you would have discovered that it was one of the places where slaves escaping from the United States ran and were released into Canada and hopefully into safety. But because of border administration, frequently they were pursued there. And my wife has often said, I wonder if we ever got in there, how many bodies would we find in the forest? Because if you can't make them come home, you make sure they never come back. That's not ancient Egypt. That's Canada in my history. If you need them more, you fear them and you hate them more. These are such old stories. And I can hear them saying, as they work under harder and harder labor, if we ever get out of here. By the way, they multiply even more during this process. And you can say, how could that be? I can give you two very good reasons for it. Number one, if you take away every pleasure in life, which is what you do when you make someone a slave, the only solace that a man will find is in the arms of a woman. And a woman's understanding of her only usefulness is to bear children, so that the only social security they will ever have will be their kids. By the way, that obtains around the world still today. We often go around the world telling other people what their foreign policy and their home policy should be, when none of the social safety networks that we have exist for them, and only children can guarantee any kind of survival to that family, any kind. So I don't think this is far-fetched at all. Well, the plan is not working. Slavery is not slowing them down. And so they call in the two Hebrew midwives, that is, midwives for the Hebrews. The fact that there are two of them probably means they are the head of a whole cluster of people whose business it is to deliver babies. And to them it is said, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the sex of the baby, and if it's a boy, kill him, and if it's a girl, let her live. By the way, I picked this because I watched the news over the last 2 weeks. Have you? And I've watched things that have made me more alarmed than I have ever been in my entire life, where executive power is used to simply kill people. That's not ancient Egypt. That's the Calgary Herald. There is a difference in the book of Exodus between Egypt, in which there is a divine right of kings, the king is the law, and Israel, who are a people to whom God gives the law and says to every living, breathing Israelite, down to the very last one, it is your responsibility to discipline your life to this obedience. No outside law will do it, nor can you blame anyone else for it. I am giving it to you. And by the way, that is the foundation of democracy. That every living, breathing human being should self-discipline themselves to the law of God, so that the nation will have an easier time regulating other things. When people begin to say, nobody tells me what to do, you can pass 10,000 laws. All you will get is more conflict. Read the papers. We have forgotten that. But these midwives, I love this, had far too much respect for God. Lose respect for God and discover that your form of government begins to disintegrate. It goes. You're not safe. Other people are not safe. You cannot rely on systems. Why? Because the people within them have decided, nobody tells me what to do. The midwives had far too much respect for God. By the way, please notice the role of women in this story. And they didn't do what the king of Egypt ordered, civil disobedience. Yeah, that's women, isn't it? No. These are people who have been asked to transgress against the very principles by which they work. Many of our medical people are being asked to do that today. Take life. And the midwives say, no, not doing it. And they let the boy babies live. And the king of Egypt called them in and said, why didn't you obey my orders? By the way, in this story, and I'm not too sure I like this, but if a woman says no to you and you can't make her do what she's supposed to do, that means you're a loser. So Pharaoh is portrayed as a loser. I find that demeaning to women, but that's the way that the story has been told. They nevertheless look at the Pharaoh and say to him, we're not doing that. And they answered him, saying, the Hebrew women aren't like the Egyptian women. They're vigorous. Before the midwife can get there, they've already had the baby. Now that could well be a lie. It also could be that when you put women, and we can find this at all kinds of places on the earth, when you put women to labor, physical labor, in fields, and it says they're working in fields. Many places women are the ones who work in fields. If a woman becomes pregnant, she will work in that field to the moment of delivery, and then a cluster of women will gather around her. She'll deliver the baby, they'll wrap the baby up, strap her on her back, and she'll finish the day's work. All the time. Go to Papua New Guinea and ask them. Happens all the time. Now, I don't care how fast you call for a midwife. It's all over by the time they get there. And it is Pharaoh's prejudice to which these midwives appeal. Yeah, you're right about the sexuality of those Hebrew women. And it reminds me of all the prejudices that exist with regard to other races. A, women are very prolific. B, men are animals. I can show you that extant in our world today. If we ever get out of here, some of this will lift. And God was pleased with the midwives. Here is the narrator speaking. No email came that said God is pleased with the midwives. Neither did the midwives themselves know anything except that their own families prospered. But God was pleased with the midwives, and the narrator of the story knows that, which tells us that there are times when you act against what you know is wrong, and God's favor, though unspoken, is nevertheless there. And the people continued to increase in number, a very strong people. Because the midwives honor God, God gave them families of their own. It reminds me also of incidents in Latin America under the regime of Salvador Allende in Chile. This is several decades ago. Allende's socialist government found a threat in every kind of political opposition. Sound familiar? And would round up the opposition, frequently young adults, and cause them to be, they turned this word into a verb, disappeared. They disappeared them. It would be discovered after a long while that what they did was load them into helicopters, in many cases fly them out of the ocean and just throw them out. There became hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of disappeared grandmothers, wondering how you protest this sort of thing in a nation that has armed soldiers in the street, decided that they would organize in the town squares of the cities and towns a dance, because there was no law against dancing. You heard this story? I think it's genius. They organized dances, and the granny showed up and turned on the music. On their backs, every last one of them was a big photograph of a grandchild, at least one, that had been disappeared. They did not know where these children were. And they began to dance a waltz with an invisible partner. Can you see them whirling around? Now you think, that's the hookiest thing I ever saw, or ever heard of. First time, yes. Second time, third time, fourth time. First city, yes. Second city, third city, fourth city, fifth city, until finally it dawns on the population, we've lost thousands of citizens. Who did this? And by the way, if you think that's outrageous, ever seen a poster posted in Canada of the missing and murdered Indigenous women in this nation? Same thing. The first thing that strikes you when you see the picture is, wow, there's a lot of them. Uh-huh. That's what they did. The regime of Salvador Allende came to an end. Not simply because of that, but because the awareness became raised to a level where he had to make an account, and ultimately he fled to Spain. Grannies did it. Not just grannies, but grannies did it. Midwives did it. Midwives who never killed anybody, that was the point. But midwives who said, you can't tell us to do this, we won't do it. So Pharaoh issued a general order then to all his people, every boy, that is every Hebrew boy that is born, throw him in the Nile, but let the girls live. Now you might ask yourself, how does this work in their favor if they need the slaves but they kill the males? What happens then? It's quite simple. It's what ISIS has done in Iraq and northern northern Iraq, You take the women, the small women, and you give them to the ruling race, and they have children with them. It's called ethnic cleansing in a different sense. You purify the race by injecting your blood, literally, and you raise up from all of these young women more slaves to serve you, who are then a part of the home and part of the family and not their own group, and can therefore be more controlled. Slavery in the United States and in Canada and in Britain proceeded on that fashion in the 18th and 19th session. Isn't this cheery? I want you to go home, read the paper, and become bothered. Because this occurs in your nation and among your people and nearby, and I think there's a whole lot of us who are saying, isn't that something? We need to hear from some midwives who said, hold it just a minute. And there's a few other people here too. There's a man from a family of Levi who married a Levite woman who became pregnant, had a son, noticed that there was something about the boy and hid him for 3 months. When she couldn't hide him any longer, she made a basket boat out of reeds and covered it in pitch, placed the child in it, and set it afloat of the reeds at the edge of the Nile. Now, if you're a mom, you don't do that unless you don't have another choice. Unless they're coming for that child. Does this remind you of something that happens around Christmas time? It always strikes me that at Christmas time, the part of the Christmas story we leave out is the slaughter of the innocents, the coming into Bethlehem to kill all of the babies under a certain age in order to eliminate the one supposedly called the King of the Jews, which is one of the ways Matthew says Jesus comes in the footsteps of Moses to give the law again. And the baby's older sister found herself at a vantage point a little way off and watched to see what would happen to him. And I can just hear her saying, if we ever get out of here. If you notice that, there is always an occasion to say, if we ever get out of here. That there is a challenge that comes before it that says, this will require action on your part. You're not getting out of here unless you act. And Pharaoh's daughter comes down to bathe among the reeds. And her maidens strolled on the bank. They're sort of like her posse, to keep things private, so that she can bathe. And she saw the basket boat floating in the reeds and sent her maid to get it. She opened it and saw the child, a baby crying. By the way, if you want other stories like this of the preservation of babies, come and see me after the service. I can tell you. Her heart went out to him, and she said, this must be one of the Hebrew babies. How did that family know that there would be any sympathy in the household of Pharaoh for a Hebrew baby? I don't know. That's a risk that was taken. But they did. And then his sister was before her, the sister of the baby. Do you want me to go and get a nursing mother from the Hebrews so she can nurse the baby for you? And in fact, she does, and goes and finds the child's mother herself, who now has her baby restored, now has the protection of Pharaoh's household, and gets paid to nurse her baby. And the idea is, in Pharaoh's household, is the very one he wanted to eliminate. Who put him there? 2 midwives, 2 possibly teen girls, 1 mom. I love it. Grannies all over again. Does this mean men have nothing to do? No, frequently this happens because men are dead. That's what happened in Chile. They were gone. But it does say that if Israel takes upon itself the law of God and the commandments of God, it is incumbent upon every single one of them, right down to a teenage girl, in a culture that does not have women as equal with men. Nevertheless, it says to them, do something. Act on your own. Be self-disciplined to your own law. Don't look there with your arms folded and say, somebody ought to do something. You know why I'm preaching this sermon? Because for the longest time, the big finger's been coming out of the clouds at my own forehead, saying, do something. Do something about the rise of hatred in Canada. Do you realize that in Charlottesville, just last week, when that young woman was killed, there were trucks there with Canadian license plates on them, charging people in that neo-Nazi rally. And since then, we've had another rally in London, Ontario. Do something. What are we doing? For the preservation of God and obedience to his commandments. There is power in the blood. The power that saved you from your sin is the power of the Holy Spirit that raised Jesus Christ from the dead. That power is whispering in your ear, do something. Do something. And after the child was weaned, she presented him to Pharaoh's daughter who adopted him as her son. She named him Moses, pulled out and said, I pulled him out of the water. I love the name Moses because it could be Hebrew and it could be Egyptian. This is a crossover name. Tells you where this is going, doesn't it? But I've got to quit now just with this story and then we're gone. Or you're going to say, if we ever get out of here. By the way, some of you are saying that about your church. We don't have a transitional minister. We don't have a pastor. Will we ever get out of here? Yeah, we'll get out of here. Probably if you do something that does not break down but builds up the congregation. That would be a good idea, wouldn't it? Yeah. Prince Edward Island, United Church Women. How peaceful. How unthreatening. United Church Women. Right? Where's Sandra? There she is. I knew I'd get a rise out of Sandra. Has a Presbyterial Child Poverty Committee for Prince Edward Island. Now, some of you have been to PEI and say, are there any problems in PEI? Apparently so. One of them is child poverty, and the UCW's on it. Do you know what they did? They made little rag dolls, nice ones. They made little rag dolls, one for every MLA in the legislature. They sent a rag doll to every MLA in the legislature, from the premier on down. And in their non-threatening way, they said, we're watching what you do about child poverty in Prince Edward Island. Now, in an election, don't mess with the UCW in Prince Edward Island. You get it? I get it too. All right. Then listen to the voice that is saying to you right now, rising within you, do something. God bless you.